I know it's exciting to be here, right? I'm very excited to be here, and I'm excited that you're all here this morning to get a chance to hear from our Focus on Faith speaker this morning, the Reverend Dr. Mark Labberton. Mark is currently President Emeritus and Professor of Preaching Emeritus at Fuller Theological Seminary in California, where he also got his Master's of Divinity degree before getting his doctorate at Cambridge. Mark has been a Presbyterian minister for over 40 years, most of that time at First Presbyterian Church in Berkeley. Mark has written a number of books and hosts a podcast now, which he's really much enjoying these days. But Mark is really just a wonderful explicator of the gospel in our culture and has some wonderful things to share with us this morning. I'm really excited to have you get a chance to hear him. If you weren't at 8:45, you won't want to miss 11 o'clock to get to hear a little bit more as he dives through the book of Daniel for us, which, as you'll realize if you haven't already, how relevant it is today. So please join me in welcoming Mark Labberton.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It really is a great joy, and I give thanks to Kevin and to the committee who invited me here to be here this weekend. It's really a wonderful honor, and as I said at the beginning of the first service, it's just a warm hospitality. So thank you for all that. The book of Daniel is a book that some of you, this is reviewed, maybe even triple review. It's a book that exists in the Old Testament and a part of the canon in which Israel is in exile, or anticipating being in exile, or just having left exile. It's a little indeterminate exactly how one understands the position of the writer, but the story that's being told is the story of the implications of Israel being sent into exile. Being sent into exile really because they had so utterly failed to do what all of the prophets that God had sent had called them to do. To say that your worship has to show up in your life. And if it doesn't show up in your life, then it's bankrupt. And Isaiah says to Israel, for example, I hate your worship. Why? Because you may have done everything right liturgically, but you've absolutely failed to live the reality that the worship that you just did is actually naming. Are you ready to live into that world and show that by the character of how you act in the world, which is why the prophets say so much about doing justice and love and mercy. Isaiah 58 is probably one of the key texts here where we see this picture of God saying through the prophet, you worship me as if you practiced righteousness. It's really this sense of a pretense of worship. If you actually worship me, you would practice righteousness and it would show up in the character and life and activities of your day. It would be evident that you are my distinct people, that you don't bow down and worship foreign idols, that you are faithful to me, not just in your liturgical practices, but in the way that you actually live and vote and decide and love and engage the world that's around you. That's the crisis. And every prophet has their own version of declaring to Israel, you fail to live consistently, where what you say and what you do are the same thing. Some of you may be acquainted with the man who said these words, but he was telling a story about the dramatic premature birth of his granddaughter, and who was born weighing 1 pound, 8 ounces. And he rushed to the hospital. This was Max Dupree, the head of the Herman Miller Company for many years. He rushed to the hospital, and the head nurse said, Max, what you need to do is you need to come every day and very gently put your hands through the sides of the incubator and gently, super, super gently touch your granddaughter and say to her again and again at the same time how much you love her. Because, she said, what she needs more than anything else is to connect your voice to your touch. Now, Max tells that story in part for leaders, to say that leaders have to match what they say with what they do. But we are all leaders. And for all Christians, the idea of being people whose voice and whose touch, what we say and what we do, is actually one thing. And the failure to do that is why hypocrisy is the number one critique against the church, and probably has been throughout millennia. So this is all part of the pretext. Then God says, okay, I'm going to take away every good sign that I've given you, that you are my special people. I've condemned your worship because your failure to live your worship, just to liturgically practice it, but not to let it impact the way you actually show up in the world. I'm now going to send you into exile, and as you're in exile, I'm going to be asking you serious questions. When I've stripped you of all of those blessings, now who are you? How are you going to live in the world? Who are you going to trust? Who and what will you worship? This was really the purpose of the spiritual discipline of exile. And it was meant to be an opportunity to clarify their worship. So Daniel, the book of Daniel, shows up as a book which is trying to be a book that says, this is what faithful exilic life looks like. This is what it means to remember and practice your identity, which is what chapter 1 is really about. How do we remember who we are? And that we belong to Yahweh, even though we may live in Nebuchadnezzar's house. Chapter 2, which is where we're going to spend our time now, is a chapter where Nebuchadnezzar, who's clearly already demonstrated himself to be this man of merciless power and greed and desire, decides that he's really the center of reality, until one night he has this extraordinarily unnerving dream, a nightmare of nightmares. It's not clear what the nightmare is, and you may know the way the story goes, that he's so anxious to get a word of interpretation, to understand what to make of this dream, that he does go to his soothsayers and enchanters and magicians of the day to say, how would you interpret this? But actually what ends up happening is that they say, no, sir, the thing is you have to first tell us the dream and then we'll interpret it. And he says, no, I'm not interested in the usual song and dance. I know how you play that game. No, I will know it has authority if you can tell me both what the dream is and what it means. Well, they said no one on heaven and earth could possibly do that. There's no possible way that anyone could do that. And he threatens them with their life. This is a pattern that if you've been in the first service, you've heard again in chapter 3. But in this moment, their lives are under threat because he is desperate for a real, authentic word of truth about this completely threatening and dangerous dream. Daniel and his friends are a bit in the wings. They're not the first group of people that were called forward. They ask in a sidebar-like way, as chapter 2 says, so why is this so distressing? What's going on? Why is there such anxiety over this? And they come forward and they eventually approach Nebuchadnezzar, and they say that while they have no power to do this whatsoever, they do believe in a God who might be able to give a gift like this. And therefore, we're going to seek God on your behalf. You can imagine the prayer meeting this was. This was not just your run-of-the-mill prayer meeting. It was more like, this time we really, 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 really have to pray because our lives are on the line, and the man is going to do us in if we don't deliver the good news that he wants. A knowledge of the dream and its interpretation. They pray, and in a really quite amazing way, God provides comfort and guidance and assurance and clarity, both about what the nature of the dream was and about what it meant. But before they go back to Nebuchadnezzar and tell all of this, they have a time of prayer. You can imagine how, if we step inside the narrative as it really is portrayed, there's this sense that you can imagine how much they might have wanted to capitalize on this. Yes, isn't it just extraordinary that we are the most brilliant? We are the ones, unlike your soothsayers and enchanters and magicians. They couldn't deliver, but we who have been captive, who live in your house and are being assimilated into your culture and context, we are the ones who can actually give the very thing the king wants. But listen to what they say in their prayer that reveals an entirely different perspective. Daniel said, "Blessed be the name of God from age to age, for wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons, deposes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the dark, and light dwells with him. To you, O God of my ancestors, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and power, and have now revealed to me what we asked of you, for you revealed to us what the king ordered. Now, it's again interesting that this is a recitation of a prayer that says, let's get grounded again in this disorientation of exile. Let's remember who is God and who is not God. We are not the ones who, having been given this revelation, are going to slyly slip into God's place and claim that they were the ones that produced it. No, they stop and remember that it was God who did this. Then they approach Nebuchadnezzar, and in doing so, Daniel and friends are going to share news that's extremely uncomfortable, as Nebuchadnezzar had already felt. But first of all, before they even do this, now we want you to know, King, this was not our wisdom. We sought the God of heaven, and that God has revealed to us both the dream and its interpretation. We'll tell you that we wish that it was for someone else, because it is a dire analysis of what's actually happening. And basically the dream is this revelation of the undoing of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. It's an image of a statue, the statue that is then built by Nebuchadnezzar, ironically, in chapter 3. But he takes control of the nightmare in chapter 3 by building it. But first we hear what it was. It was this statue, golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And in various layers, all the way down to the bottom, the metals become less and less and less precious. And at the bottom, it says that at the very bottom of the whole statue is hay. It's like an image that says, you, Nebuchadnezzar, it's all going to crumble down. It's all about your loss. Nebuchadnezzar, putting himself at the top of the universe, can hardly even absorb this. It causes him to barely breathe. No wonder he's so panicked and anxious. But Daniel and his friends, having heard from God, then boldly go and actually announce this news. Nebuchadnezzar, your kingdom's falling. It will inevitably come undone. It may look like gold at the top, but at the bottom, it's all going to crumble. And that is the future of your kingdom. I wish it was not true, they say, but that is the dream and its interpretation. And amazingly, Nebuchadnezzar thanks them for this word. Just like a person who's really anxious about a medical diagnosis, right, where you're so afraid of the worst possible outcome, and sometimes it is the worst possible outcome. But when the physicians are actually able to tell us the truth, there is a sense of gratitude to finally know what the answer to the puzzle really is. In Nebuchadnezzar's case, it's like, okay, you've actually delivered the truth, and that is what I wanted. I didn't want the song and dance of my usual array of soothsayers and enchanters. I wanted a word with a spiritual authority and truthfulness. And that's what you give. And even though what you've just told me is dire and terrible news, I thank you for it, and gives honor even to the God in some way that they worship. It's a sort of gesture of some kind. So whoever that God is and whatever that God is about, in a world of polytheism where there were lots of other gods, it probably wasn't so hard for Nebuchadnezzar to easily grant them one. So your God pulled this off. Good for God. But retains everything about his own narcissism, his own power, his own central reality. And Daniel and his friends, again, are reminded of the faithfulness and love of God. Now, what is this chapter about in this larger sense of the book of Daniel? When we are stripped or challenged, where the things that we have presumed, especially the life of Israel in Israel at that time, they felt they had the golden ticket. It was all clearly laid out. They resented and resisted God's word because they just wanted things to be just like they had made them, a very domesticated form of worship, a very domesticated kind of faith, something that fit in their pocket and in their routine and in their habits of life. Then God sends these prophets. They do not accept it. They're sent into exile. And now who are we? Chapter 1 is about how do they remember every time they eat that they belong to God and not to Yahweh, not to Nebuchadnezzar. But now in chapter 2, the question is, what do the people of God bring to a desperately spiritually needy place? If we did a kind of spiritual diagnosis of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, it would be a kingdom of extraordinary singular power, where he himself was the person who reigned over everything else, and really everything was simply as Nebuchadnezzar wanted it to be, and there was no challenging Nebuchadnezzar. The loss of their life was a common expectation that Nebuchadnezzar just would do away with you if you weren't conforming to his will. What do these now deported, disoriented refugees in Nebuchadnezzar's house do when they have no power, they have no voice, they were not invited to the table, they have apparently nothing to offer, there's no benefit to them being there yet, they're still being groomed into the character of a life that was going to serve Nebuchadnezzar's interests. But with confidence really in who they are, and with an acknowledgement of a crisis, which they don't pretend to actually even fully understand or know what they're going to do. They dare to step into it. They approach Nebuchadnezzar. They ask hard questions. Nebuchadnezzar declares very hard news. They, without any pretense that they were capable, excuse me just a sec. Without any pretense that they were capable, they end up offering themselves to God. We want you to use us. Is there anything you would give us in this place? Is there a power that's beyond us that you might give us that would be able to rise to this particular occasion? Everything seemed desperate. And then, by the providence and grace of God, God gives them what they ask for, and this unusual gift. See, the thing about being exiles is that in exilic life, you feel it's all a story of loss. We're not on the land. We're not near the temple. We don't have the sacrificial system. We don't have the priests. We don't have the smells and bells, as it were, of certain kinds of worship. All of that told them a story that they were comfortable with, but now they can't rely on that story. They are wondering, where is God in this particular time? And what occurs is that God actually turns out to be an exile. And as this theme is picked up in the New Testament, Jesus is really the leading exile. That's the nature of how the gospel shows up. Jesus is an exile, born in a place and a context in which, again, dominating authoritarianism exists, overwhelming expressions of power. The presence of Rome was everywhere. And now into that world as an exile. In Philippians 2, you probably know the language where Paul says, for though equal with God, he did not hold on to his power, but laid it down, entering into the exile of an incarnation, of actually coming without the trappings of apparent deity into a world where, as a human being, he was as vulnerable to all the other things that other people were vulnerable to as well. He was the leading exile. And there is a way that the New Testament is saying to the people of God, you are strangers in a strange land. You live in a context where the body of Christ that he's cultivating and nurturing is saying to us, I want you to live as peculiar people. I want you to remember that you belong to me, even though so much seems like loss. There's so much more that can yet be found. It was a ministry to Nebuchadnezzar in the end, and we'll come to that. But the first ministry was the ministry to Daniel and his friends. Imagine feeling stripped of all of these things, and then somehow God came to them in their desperation, like we hear in Exodus, that God heard the cries of the vulnerable. God heard the cries of Daniel and his friends and provided this good gift. So the good gift of being a faithful exile is to discover, even in exile, that God is there, and that God is with us, that God can actually be for us, and that God sets us free, which is what chapter 3 is about. But I'll leave that for the second service. So the gift and wonder of this chapter is, honestly, first, we're in exile. We have only ourselves. And this cruel dictatorial leader, is there any hope? Is there any word from God? Or is it just barrenness? Do I just look everywhere and see nothing but emptiness and void? Or is it the case that God could actually meet us as exiles in this place, with really hard news, for the most threatening person in their world, to go to that person and say, it's even worse than you imagine. Your kingdom is coming down. Now, the gift of that was harsh for Nebuchadnezzar, but it was true. The longer word, the greater word that stands for the people of God, Israel, as well as for the church, is God is still committed to that long word, and in season and out of seasons, in times of megalomania and in times of less megalomania. Whatever it is that we might live, whether we feel like we're in a season that's mostly empty and a void, or whether we're living in a season that feels to us like it's really clear and full and identified, whichever it may be, God is in that place. And here to discover as exiles, feeling the loss, the disorientation, the fear, the anxiety, this is the hope of chapter 2. Now, when I think about the history of the United States, one of the interesting things is, as we know, that these two themes of the two paradigms of Exodus and exile are woven into the American narrative. So part of the American narrative is an Exodus theme of people who, seeking a religious freedom, came to our shores and began to establish a country which fairly quickly, early on, began to be identified in a number of ways, but eventually becomes a nation that was seen as the promised land the more and more and more they understood about it. And there's a great deal of promised land thinking which has pervaded our history, the uniqueness and blessing of God in this place. But the other part of the narrative of Israel is also evident in the history of America. That is, people who come to the shores as exiles, people who find their way here by will of their own, or by force, as in slavery, or by some other circumstance in which they come here simply leaving behind all that they had and now trying to find their way. And some feel like exiles, even if they've lived here, of course, their whole life, and that this is the only world they identify with, but they are disoriented because the thing that is around them is not the thing that is the life that they seek. A disorientation which can come about through so many forces, subtle forces of injustice and suffering and poverty and injustice, so many things that can cause people to lose their bearings and to think they're all alone. We might experience it despite all the blessings of God. I've known plenty of people with plenty of means, with plenty of capital in every sense of the word, who are fundamentally feeling like their life is a life in exile. Who are they? What are they about? I remember meeting this very young faculty member at the University of California, Berkeley. He was not a Christian. He was a person who had heard our services at the time it was on the radio. And in that context, he had begun listening, and he set up a meeting that we had together. And he said, here's the thing. I have gotten everything I've ever wanted. I'm the youngest person ever to be tenured in my department. I've already had not just 2 successful academic books, but I've also had a third book, which is a popular book that has also reached the bestseller list. I have everything that I could have ever imagined wanting as a teenager, as a young adult, etc. And he said, I have no idea what any of it means. He was declaring himself an exile, an absolute insider, and yet an exile. No framework of meaning, no understanding of why he existed, why this work that he was doing, in his case in political science, none of that gave him any clarity about why his life mattered, why he existed, what he was really about in the world, how he was meant to use his energies. All he knew was how to produce magnificently academic, achieving papers and books. But why, where it fit into any larger narrative, was really absent. I think there are a lot of people who, for lesser degrees of disorientation perhaps, still find themselves in context. And certainly in this era of our nation's life, part of the polarization that has many different explanations and descriptions, but part of the polarization is people just honestly being lost and fundamentally wanting to cling to some pole or the other to make sure that they have some sense of stability. I'm going to belong here, or I'm going to belong there. And in the context of that, find community. They find other people that are going to reinforce that. They hear the drumbeat of whatever might be being offered, and they bow in response to that particular sound. But at the core, there is so much disorientation. And because so many things are changing, and changing so fast in our nation, and frankly in the world as well, and in the global church as well as in our national church, there is this incredible sense of turmoil. How do we find ourselves? How do we find each other? And most of all, how do we come to live this deeply grounded orientation in the midst of disorientation? This is what Israel had been offered by God, Yahweh, the faithful one who makes and keeps promises, who said, you belong to me, I am your people, you are my people, and I am your God. That kind of utter clarity. We're living in a time when there's so much disorientation that the challenge of being oriented should not, I want to argue, be found at either of the poles, but should be found not necessarily at the center in the sense of an anemic center, but in a vigorous affirmation and discovery and rediscovery that there is power that God alone can bring into a world that may just feel like disorientation. A resource that the church is meant to be and bear witness to receive from God, to live in light of that, and to actually be able to let that make a difference in the world that's around us. Let me just share a couple of examples, and then we'll have some conversation. A friend of mine named Gary Haugen was the head of the Rwandan genocide investigation. He was the one who was sent by the UN and others to investigate at the time when all the decimated bodies were still lying in all of the stadiums and the churches and everything else that was around. And for 6 months, he and this group of other lawyers and other people were trying to simply understand, how had this happened? What was it that caused it? What is the body count? They were the ones that came to the 900,000 at least that had been killed in 90 days. Just an extraordinary event. And so he has that experience, which I have to say, if I'd had that experience, I would have eventually come back and probably entered a mental hospital because it just would have been so staggering. But in Gary's case, he comes back and he decides that the really important thing to do is to respond to other global needs where other powers are destroying people's lives. And he realizes that all kinds of Christian organizations are committed to water and food and development. But there's no Christian organization that's actually devoting itself to the cause of justice. And there are so many people who in so many places have no avenue of finding justice, no legal protection. There's not a legal protection, and there's no functioning justice system. And in the context of that, how are people that are at the bottom of the totem pole, vulnerable in every possible way, going to find their identity? This unfolds into the development of a ministry which is called International Justice Mission. It's the largest anti-human trafficking organization in the world. And it has delivered millions of lives from slavery. There are more people enslaved in the world now than there have ever been. And in the context of that, it means going into the vortex of some of the deepest, darkest evil and destruction of people's lives that you can imagine. Staggering. And in those contexts, you enter not into the promised land. You're not in Exodus. You're in exile. And you're with people who are even in a greater exile, utterly lost. Can it be possible that despite all of the poverty, the literal poverty, and the poverty of imagination, the poverty of law, and the poverty of justice, in the midst of all that, can God actually show up? And it turns out that over the 27 years of this ministry, God has shown up again and again and again, changing the hearts and minds of judges in places who were up to that point only interested in themselves, changing legal systems, building legal systems, getting governments to acknowledge that this terrible set of crimes are crimes that can actually be engaged and beaten. It's driven by power, it's driven by money, it's driven by a kind of evilness that is just pervasive in this industry. And in the context of that, God can and does show up. And there are millions of people alive today because there was an exile, Gary Haugen, who went into the exilic context of places all around the world with a team of others, first from the United States and now completely from those countries around the world, and delivering a word of life, an act of rescue, a building of a functioning justice system, that in 5 years from now, we believe that we will be at a place where 300 million people will have legal protection for the first time in history. Imagine that. Where did that imagination come from? It came from believing that though everything seems to be lost, there is a God who actually hears the prayers of Daniel and his friends, who hears the prayers of Gary Haugen, who hears the prayers of lots of people in those particularly daunting, overwhelming settings, and actually shows up with a redemptive hope. And now many of those survivors have gone into this very work. It turns out many of them are highly intelligent people. Many of them with the right education have now become lawyers. Many of them are people who are now pursuing how to join this effort to lead within their own country. How did that happen? Because of this imagination, an act of imagination, that Daniel and his friends dared to believe that in exile, God could be near and provide. The question that I think we have to ask ourselves is, in whatever place we might be in, or we believe the nation is in, or that the American church is in, or in places of desperation around the world, in times like this, do we believe that there is a God who actually is not captive to a party, is not captive to any particular ideology, is not captive to a certain sociology or to a certain class or a certain race? It's the God who holds all things, and that God wants to be present in the darkest of places, which may not ever be as dark as some of the slave mills that IJM goes into, but might be dark enough in our heart or in our family or in our relationships or in our workplace or in our neighborhood or in our city to actually lead us to go to places and humbly do things that can only be possible if God is in that. Exiles have to ask themselves, when I'm stripped of all of the evidence of God's presence in the land and the temple and everything else, do I dare to believe that there is a God who could actually show up here? That is really the question. Sometimes it's done on a social level. Sometimes it's done on a more personal level. I think, for example, of a time when there was a woman in our church who had really lived as a faithful exile. At the time of this story, she's 87 years old. She's tall, beautiful, fine-boned, silver-haired woman, the kind of woman who had her hair done at 11 on Friday every week. And she would show up in her glory and magnificence. But she actually had a pretty remarkable spirit and knew that God showed up in dark places. And her life, despite her appearance, had known more dark places than you might have ever guessed. In the context of all of that, I get word one Sunday in between services that something terrible has happened to Doris as she was coming toward the church. It sounded like she had somehow gotten roughed up, and I didn't know what that was about, and nobody had any information except that she was on her way home. So I decided, of course, I would immediately go there after the second service. So I go to the service. She's not exactly herself, but she's okay, and she invites me to come in her usual way, offering me the hospitality of coffee, tea, biscuits, whatever it is. I said, no, Doris, really, we can do that another time, but I heard that something terrible happened to you this morning. She said, yeah, it was a very unusual morning. I said, well, tell me about it. I want to hear what happened. She said, well, I was just reaching back into my car. You know that place that I park? I said, I do. I know where you park. She said, well, I was just in that place where I park, and it was on the street, and I had reached back in across the driver's seat to the passenger seat to get my duck date muffins. You know those muffins that I make? I think you like those. I do. I like those date muffins. Well, I was just trying to reach for the date muffins when suddenly I was struck from behind by someone, and I was pushed into the car, across the console, into the passenger seat, and this man who was doing this grabbed the keys behind me, put them in the ignition, closed the door, and took off. And I said, what are we doing? What is happening? Who are you? I thought, right, note to self when being kidnapped, ask your kidnapper's name. Turned out, she told him his name. It was Danny. Danny, what are we doing? Well, we're going to go to your bank because I need some money. Why do you need money? Because I'm a drug addict. Why are you a drug addict? Well, that's another story. First bank stop, he coerces her, of course, by intimidation to give her passcode, and he has her keys and all of that. Goes to the first machine, comes back, and she says, this is really terrible. Have you done this to other people? This is really an awful thing. Are you just a person that goes around and kidnaps people and takes money from their bank machines? And he said, well, I have to support my drug habit. Well, it's a terrible thing that you're a drug addict. Did you know that it's a terrible thing that you're a drug addict? You should really get into a really good drug rehab program. Oh, I've been in all kinds of drug rehab programs. None of them have ever worked. Next stop, they make 2 more stops, and then he's about to leave her, having gotten the money that he needed for the day. So Doris can't even get out of the car, and so she says that to him. And so he comes around to the driver's seat and opens the door and escorts her around to the driver's side and helps her into the car and lifts up her legs and puts the seatbelt across her and then leans in and gives her a kiss on the cheek. She said, listen, I'm going to pray that you get caught because this is terrible. You should never do this to people. This is completely wrong. Secondly, you need Jesus because this is way bigger than you, like way, way bigger than you. You do need a good drug rehab program, but even good drug rehab programs need even more resources, which I believe are spiritual resources and which God can give even you. And with that, he was off. I said, Doris, that is just a harrowing, horrible, horrible story. She said, I know, but as I was sitting there, I thought, I bet there's other people, even today, that have been kidnapped. Note to self, when thinking about being kidnapped, join the fellowship of the kidnapped on any given day that you might be a part of. Doris, I said, I came here thinking I could finally be your pastor, but I feel like maybe you could now pray for your trauma with me because I actually feel traumatized by your trauma. And we had a little time of prayer, and it wasn't a surprise that a couple weeks later, I get this call from Doris. I was asked to come in for a lineup, and sure enough, there was Danny, third from the left. He was right there. So he's now been held, and eventually I went with her to the day that she went into the courtroom, and she sat in the witness chair, and she testified that she would tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and in the context of that, she more or less just quickly was allowed somehow permission to be able to say, hi, Danny, it's me, Doris. Remember, we had that time in the car together. And everything that is you've been accused of by me is absolutely true, and she under questioning, went through all the things that he had done and told the story again. And then toward the end, she was about to be dismissed, and she said, Judge, can I have a word with you? So just out loud, she said, so here's the story. He's completely guilty, and he should definitely put in jail. But he has some needs. He's a drug addict, so he really needs not just a regular drug rehab program, but a really good and trustworthy drug rehab program. And secondly, he needs Jesus. I'll take care of the Jesus part, but you really need to give him jail and a good drug rehab program. So what does Doris do? She ends up recovering, of course, from the trauma. She was not too badly bruised, but her concern was really for Danny. And so once he was in jail, which happened to be in Berkeley, for about 8 months before he was moved eventually to another jail outside in another part of the state, she went about every other week just to call on Danny, to talk to him about his drug habit, which she happened to have expertise in, and to tell him the story of God's love in Jesus Christ that can overcome even the most powerful addiction. And in the context of that, offering him a word of hope. I don't know what Danny did with that news, but what I can say is that for me, Doris is a faithful exile, completely disoriented, without power in the moment of in the car. Shouldn't have happened. It was a terrible crime. Should be stopped. Did get stopped. Guilty party was found. All of that was taken care of. But she saw beyond the crisis to the reality of a human being made in the image of God with tremendous needs and problems, that she could actually share the good news of a love and a power that is greater than the power of drugs, than greater than any kind of loss or suffering or pain he may have endured. And it was there that they dwelled for 6 to 8 months, just working that reality again and again. He always let her visit him. He never said no, even though she had been the one that he had taken captive. What does faithful exilic life look for you or for me? Let's just pause and see if there's any questions, reactions, tomatoes, whatever you might want to invite into the moment. Daniel chapter 2. Anything you'd like to ask?
Jesus as an exile.
Yes.
First I've ever heard that.
Yes.
And it's something to think about.
Right. She's just noting that she hadn't heard the idea that Jesus was in exile before, and he was, and in one sense is. Yeah. Other comments or questions? I realize we may have run out of all of our time, but. Well, I'm very thankful to be with all of you, and if those of you who are here are coming to the third service, the second service, you'll hear the third chapter, which is where the story goes. And in the first 3 chapters of Daniel, I think have to be read in this sort of narrative way that shows how each chapter builds a central component. And by the time you get to chapter 3, you understand much more why the drama of that chapter is so important. So thank you again for being here. And I pray that we will live as faithful exiles. Thanks.